College and today's broadcast of the North Idaho College Public Forum. The crew is comprised of North Idaho College television students. Your moderator is North Idaho College political scientist Tony Stewart.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I welcome you to part 2 of a 3-week series that we are having with professors from the Department of Political Science at Washington State University. I also want to take this opportunity to thank KUID, located on the campus of the University of Idaho, for the use of their studio for these productions. Our guest today is Professor Wallaford Peterson from Washington State University. He holds a baccalaureate degree, master's degree, and a PhD degree from the University of Minnesota, and has taught at Washington State University since 1968. Dr. Peterson is particularly known in recent times for his work and study on the Chrisman versus Washington case, which comes from the campus of Washington State University and was before the High Court. But also he certainly is known as an expert on the First Amendment's discussion and also on the 14th separation of church and state, and has had many years' work with that, and we invite him today to deal with that particular topic. Dr. Peterson, welcome back to our program.
Thank you, Tony. Glad to be here.
I would like to say to our viewers that you've been very kind. You've taken much time to do these productions, and we greatly appreciate that. We welcome to the program to assist me in questioning our guest today, a sophomore pre-law student at North Idaho College, Rich Cook, and Rich Cook is invited to commence the questioning.
Thanks, Tony. Dr. Peterson, I'd like to start off with a very basic question. That is, the authors of our Constitution and our policymakers since have focused quite a bit of their attention on keeping church and state separate. My question, in fact, is why is this so necessary?
The answer is complex, and I wish it were simple, but answers typically are not simple to those kinds of questions. You can look at it from the church's point of view. Say Roger Williams, early in our colonial history, would have said we must keep church and state separate in order to keep the church pure, in order to keep it from corruption. In other words, the church, if it is influenced by the state, will not be its true self. That was Roger Williams' argument. Indeed, he was the one, as far as I can tell, who developed the phrase, the wall of separation, because he said there is the garden of the church and the wilderness of the world, and the wall must keep the wilderness out. Now let's move to another person in our early history, Thomas Jefferson. He took the view that you must keep church and state separate in order to keep the government from being excessively influenced by the church, by special church groups that have their idea of what is good, true, and moral, using power of the government to force other people to be good, true, and moral. And so in our early history, we had two rather different answers given to the question of why should they be separate. The Williams answer said to keep the church pure, and the Jefferson answer said to keep the state from being a mere tool of the church. I think one other point can be made, and Jefferson and Williams both would have made this, and that is in an age when there are so many different religious groups, so many different religious sects. And by the way, just yesterday, I believe the Supreme Court said that the Moonies were indeed a true religious group. They were not a commercial organization. They were a true religious group. Well, when you have so many religious groups and sects in operation as we have here, the only way to satisfy people that the state isn't giving preference to one is to try to maximize the separation between church and state.
I think this is a good time to interject on Rich's question. The court must at times determine what is a religion, because some groups in recent years have used the name of religion to deal with things that some people question of whether that was their motive, such as drugs. How does the court go about establishing a principle that a certain organization is a legitimate religion under this issue?
Well, the courts have had a great deal of difficulty with that, and they try to look at, I suppose you would say, the whole picture that they have presented before them, and determine whether or not this is a religion in a kind of, I suppose you might say, traditional sense of the word, and yet they're bothered by that because they know that religious groups might take new and different forms. And therefore, they have been at times almost willing to say anybody who calls himself a religion is a religion. But when that group clearly does something in the court's view that violates morals, for example, use of LSD as a sacrament. The church in Washington, D.C. once tried that, a quote church around it. The court said, well, no, that's not a churchly function, and the federal Supreme Court has not done much of a job of actually defining churches, but state courts have had to try, and it's extremely difficult.
There have been a multitude of, I think I'm using the proper word, of cases before the High Court concerning the question of religion and state. And I know that you have been very effective in the past in discussing really three definitions that are involved in trying to determine if the state is involved with religion and it violates the First Amendment. I'm speaking of, for example, of purpose, etc. Would you please explain that to our viewers?
Yes, in a series of cases that were decided in, the late 60s and then early 70s, the Supreme Court said that it had a rule that it was going to stick to. And it was the primary purpose, the principal effect, and excessive entanglement rule. And it meant this, that if the state did something, it could not have a religious purpose. That one hasn't been very difficult for the courts to handle. They have typically said state legislation does not have religious purposes. When, for example, the states give money for a physics building to a college in the state that's owned by a church-related agency. The courts have been willing to say, well, that's not a religious purpose, even though the college has some religious dimension. But the more difficult of the three elements is the effect. Does the state action have a religious effect? And here, the courts have been worried about indirect and long-term effects, and so for parochial schools at the elementary, secondary level, that is, rather than colleges, the court has been willing to say that taxation benefits to parents who send their children to parochial schools will so benefit those schools so enormously that it will have a religious effect. And then the issue of entanglement, of course, presents a great deal of difficulty. The court has struck down some state programs where the justices have said there would be so much interaction between church officials and state officials that you wouldn't be able to tell who was really running things, and therefore there was an excessive entanglement. So that's the test, but after saying that's a test, we should add this, is that the justices who use that test decide differently on different cases. So it's not a very useful test. It doesn't tell a judge what to do in a specific case.
When you get into some areas in very modern times, in the last decade in particular, if you got involved in such an issue as blue laws and so forth, and if those are coming from some religion because they believe certain things shouldn't take place on certain days, would this fall under excessive entanglement if a legislature attempted to force people to behave that way on a given day?
Well, this is one of the more interesting dimensions of the whole church-state issue. Blue laws have been passed by states for a long time, and surprisingly to many people who want to pass them, the courts have said they're not religious at all. They simply serve the secular purpose of giving a day of rest, which people benefit from, whether they have religion or not. Now, the Supreme Court said that back in 1961, but it wasn't new or revolutionary at that time. The New York Supreme Court, back in 1861, Civil War times, said that the New York law was not a religious law. It was a secular law, and the state could legislate, and so states can legislate what we sometimes call blue laws or Sunday laws on the theory that you need a day of rest, and so why not use Sunday? More people accept that, and that's a secular purpose. Let me point out for those persons who are profoundly religious and have a deep regard for Sunday observation, that when the state, and Roger Williams would be very, very impressed by this argument, when the state begins doing something, the religious dimension of that action is lost. Why? Well, because all sorts of different religious groups who have different ideas about this support it, and so you find it's very difficult to say that's a religious day when the state has done it, and the courts have said it's secular.
The example I've given, obviously doesn't come under that. Give us a really specific example of excessive entanglement that the government could be involved with.
Well, the entanglement that the court looked at in the 1970s was state aid to parochial schools. For example, the purchase of some educational equipment. The Supreme Court said we can't tell whether that equipment is going to be used in ways that promote religious purposes or not, and therefore we'd almost have to have a state official right at the school to see that they weren't using, for example, the movie projector to show a religious film. And that would be excessive entanglement. Other things other instances where the state was giving benefits to parochial schools, the Supreme Court has said entanglement will be too great because we'll have to have all sorts of complicated auditing systems involved, and therefore the state aid falls. And so a great part of what states have tried to do has been declared unconstitutional. Where the states have not had excessive entanglement is where the aid is given directly to the student who goes to the parochial school. For example, the school lunch program. Well, that's not aid to the school, says the court, and that's aid to the student, and there isn't excessive entanglement there.
One final point on this issue before we go back to Rich. Concerning primary and secondary education versus higher education, and in all cases when they're church funded or support or church institutions, the court's been much more liberal in allowing funds for activities at the college level than they have been for church schools at the other level. Give us some examples and indicate why this is true.
Well, I can give you examples from both federal and state law. The federal government passed a long time ago the Higher Education Facilities Act. And that gave to the states money to distribute to their colleges, regardless of whether the colleges were state colleges or church colleges, for a variety of purposes. And the states gave money to church-related colleges, and they did things like built buildings, and that was challenged. The case is called Tilton versus Richardson in Connecticut. And the Supreme Court recognized that if the state had given money to an elementary parochial school, it would have been unconstitutional. But they said that in this case, giving money to the college was not unconstitutional. Why? Well, they said because it's clearly secular. The parochial school is more religious than the college. They said the colleges are not all that religious. I know there may be some people who regret hearing this if they're supporting a religious school, but let's say perhaps the court is wrong. But at any rate, they said that the faculty teaches according to the standards of professions. They said the students are much more mature and not subject to indoctrination, a thing that sometimes a college professor would not be convinced is exactly correct. So they said that there is a great deal less religion involved at the college level, the way things are actually run, than at the parochial school level.
But I think we should make the point to our viewers, too, that whether you're talking about the college or secondary or primary, there are some areas in which no money can be spent at all, that's state money. For example, on salaries of teachers.
Yes, and we should say this, that Higher Education Facilities Act that permitted states to spend money in colleges, church-related, there's a specific exemption that says nothing here can go for the teaching of religion or for departments of religion or for the equivalent of a chapel or so on. So the court draws a line between the religious and the secular. By the way, that's a tough line to draw within some people's thinking. Some people tend to think everything is secular, doesn't have a religious dimension if they don't believe in religion, for example. But on the other hand, there are a great many religious people who say that religion pervades every facet of our life, and therefore there's no such thing as a secular action.
Rich Cook.
Yes, Dr. Peterson, I thought you brought up some very interesting points dealing with the interactions between church and state. One of the basic fundamentals of American society is equal protection under the law for all citizens. An issue has come up recently involving the church and church funding for parochial schools or federal funding for parochial schools and whatnot, is that certain religions are favored over other religions and that certain religious persons are exempted from certain laws. Exactly how far can we bend this equal protection for all citizens to fit these religious needs and still have a healthy society?
Well, again, the answer has to be very complex. Let's take an illustration. In almost all states, it's required that you attend school until at at least age 16, sometimes 18, but at least age 16. Well, you know that some of the Mennonite people, the Old Order, Amish in Wisconsin, in Iowa, they think that their students are corrupted by going to school beyond the elementary years, beyond about age 12. Well, as a result of that thought, they refuse to let their students go to school. And therefore, they run afoul the state education requirement. Now, that has come to the Supreme Court's attention, and it has had to make a decision on it, and it has argued that they are a very special, distinct group, had 300 years of history. Their people learn skills in their simple farming communities that make them very unlikely to ever be dependent on the society. In fact, those communities are marvelously successful. They have, by the way, a very low incidence of mental health problems and so on. And the court has said because they are very special in this regard and get a kind of equivalent education that serves their needs, they don't have to have their children go to school after age 14. But of course that raises an issue then. Can anybody say, well, my religion requires that my child stay out of school at age 14? And it's a very difficult problem because it looks as if you've almost given a special preference to the Amish here. In other words, almost an establishment kind of advantage to the Amish. And so you curiously here you say, well, we want to give the Amish freedom of religion. But by giving them freedom of religion, you almost give them a special status that runs into the establishment clause. You do it in other areas. You exempt some people from taxes because of their religious position. Well, there are other persons in the society who say, I serve exactly that kind of function, and yet I'm taxed. And so, by the way, some of them then try to get ministerial status, for example, so that what their property tax is changed. It's a very great problem, and I think there's no simple answer to it, and no line the court will draw will ever satisfy everybody because it's going to be a very fine line between things that are almost alike.
Dr. Peterson, the Reagan administration has brought the issue to the forefront again in the area of your expertise. Recently, they were dealing with the question of tax exemption for religious universities such as Bob Jones University and even a school in North Carolina that I believe was primary and secondary. And this deals with if they discriminate in their policies racially, for example, should they lose their tax exemption. And because of his position he took, we're going to be moving back or we are into the court. And it's caused a real uproar, as you so well know, in this country. Could you enlighten us on what is likely to be the fundamental issue before the court?
Well, I think the fundamental issue there will center more on the equal protection and race than on the religious issue, but I'm not sure of that. It depends how the justices approach that issue. You could approach it and say that a group has a right of free exercise of religion to exclude certain persons from their, including on the grounds of race, from participation in their institution. And you could say that's their belief. They believe it. Whether it's right or wrong is not a matter, or moral or immoral is not a matter. It's a part of their religious belief. And the court will have to decide whether the society's interest in racial equality in this case overrides some person's religious ideas about who they can associate with. I think it's a very difficult one to handle, because if the court denies tax exemption to those schools on grounds that they have discriminated on the basis of race, could it possibly deny tax exemption to some religious groups on grounds that they discriminate on the basis of sex? That would open a whole new argument of enormous problem.
So there's a lot of ways they can look at this
Yes.
particular issue. Rich Cook.
Dr. Peterson, I was wondering, another fundamental question. The issue of church and state has been with us for over 200 years, and it's been gaining in momentum as far as political activism by pseudo-religious groups who may have influenced the 1980 election. Can the issue ever be brought to an ironclad answer? Can we ever solve the problem and come up with a definite interpretation of what the separation has to be?
No, the line of that separates church and state will always be fluctuating. I think that there's no question about that. Society changes, its ideas change. Different pressure groups become more important in the society at one time or another. There's no way of saying the First Amendment means this for all times and all purposes. Indeed, the Founding Fathers had no idea of the problems we face today. They didn't think of many of those problems that we have before us. And of course, as the state has become more important, and I think this is a notion that merits some attention. As the state has become more important, for example, it handles a very substantial part of the total medical delivery system in the country. Once churches owned a significant number of the hospitals. As the state has moved into retirement cost funding and so on, it touches areas where previously the church had almost a monopoly. Well, as it does that, the relations between church and state are going to be altered. As some group develops, say, what the moral majority that thinks the country is, hell-bound and therefore it must be reformed, it is going to try to push the line of church-state separation in a new direction to satisfy its needs. So no, we just have to live with this one. It isn't unique in this sense. We have problems with other intergroup relations. For example, the relations between government and business. That's always fluctuating. The relations between business and labor, we legislate on that. That's always changing. This is a very problematic one because it's so emotionally explosive. That is a church-state relation.
Once again, Dr. Peterson, you have been very helpful by providing a table. And the one I have before me now, it deals with specific education issues in establishment of religion cases for the Burger Court from 1971 to 80. And as I look over this and I look at the composition of the court now that has changed by 1982, again, if you were an attorney and you were bringing educational issues before the court, what seems to be the trend or the path the court would be taking on some of these, one might call more unclear issues between church and state?
Well, when Justice Douglas and Justice Black were on the court, they were strict separationists. They didn't want the state to directly or indirectly benefit the church at all. Now they're gone. They've been replaced. Now Douglas was replaced by Justice Stevens. Stevens is almost as strict a separationist as Justice Douglas had been. Now Justice O'Connor has replaced Justice Stewart. Justice Stewart was right in the middle of the court on church-state relations. He decided cases with his colleagues against the establishment of religion and in favor of church agencies that some people said had benefited from establishment of religion in about equal measure. But he's been replaced by Justice O'Connor. And from what I can tell, just by a little writing, she is going to be less a strict separationist than was Justice Stewart. And so the court has become, by the standards of the Warren Court and early Burger Court era, a little less separationist-minded than it was. However, I think there's some things clear. For example, if a school district were to begin its days with prayer, the court would without doubt still strike that down as an unconstitutional establishment government religion. They wouldn't use that phrase, but that gets at the idea. They would say that's unconstitutional.
I'm glad you brought that point up. Since 1962, the court has been quite clear. If we're dealing with public schools now, and we're talking about either prayers or Bible reading, that's what I would believe the court called a religious service.
Yes.
Could you help our audience by explaining that those decisions of 62 and 63 did not prevent public education from dealing with religion in a historical sense, or having, even at the college level, courses in comparative religion and so forth, distinguish between religious service and discussing it in a historical perspective?
Yes, Justice Clark, who wrote the 1963 opinion, was very clear. He said that we do not mean that you can't discuss religion historically, you can't discuss religion in terms of art or poetry. You can do that. He insisted also that we are not creating anything called a religion of secularism. In other words, that public schools are not to indoctrinate religiously, or in terms of what some people call secular humanism, they are not to indoctrinate in that. And so what the court struck down in 62 and 63 was government-sponsored devotional exercises. I would say, again, I use the phrase, it struck down government religion. And you see, if you read state and federal constitutions, never in those is there any indication that state or federal government has spiritual powers. And that's why the court struck it down. The government is fresh out of religious power at all times.
But discussing something such as secular humanism is not a religious service and is not even defined as religion. Is that correct?
Well, the court said that you can discuss all of these matters in the abstract. It's when that you make religious devotionals that you've overstepped the bounds. And you could discuss secular humanism as a philosophy. You could discuss Roman Catholicism. You could discuss Lutheranism as a philosophy, but as a philosophy in the abstract.
Rich Cook.
Talking about the different philosophies of religion, I'd like to bring up another point, dealing with the teaching of evolution and creationism in public schools. What is the current Supreme Court interpretation on this?
Well, there's no Supreme Court determination on it yet. If possible, we'll have one within a couple of years. But recently, a federal district court down in Arkansas handed down a decision saying that those persons, well, the state legislature, which had passed a law requiring the teaching of creation science, had indeed established a religion because creation science was inspired primarily, overwhelmingly, by religious ideals. And therefore, when the state legislature specified creation science, it had specified really not a body of scientific knowledge, but a body of religious knowledge. The federal district court said that that was an establishment of religion, and from my own work, I think without question that that would be upheld by the Supreme Court the way the Arkansas legislature passed it. They specified a specific kind of religious doctrine, really. They didn't say a teacher can teach whatever they wish about creation. They said creation science, which is a body of knowledge that is religiously inspired, from my reading.
Dr. Peterson, I'm really sad that this time has come to a close. I have a lot of other questions I'd like to ask you. You are such a great source of information on this topic, and I know our viewers agree with me that you have really made some points very clear, and we appreciate it very much.
Well, thank you, Tony.
I want to express also the appreciation to you for being here for 2 consecutive weeks.
Okay.
And Rich Cook, thank you for your questions. Ladies and gentlemen, our guest has been Professor Walliford Peterson from the Department of Political Science at Washington State University. In the past 2 weeks, we've dealt with some what we believe to be very important constitutional issues, and we hope you've enjoyed those programs. I would invite you to be with us again next week when Professor Paul Hagner from the Department of Political Science at Washington State University will be with us, and we'll be discussing public policy and the media. I hope you have a very nice week and that you'll be with us then. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum can be seen at this same time each week over this station. This production was videotaped earlier by a North Idaho College student crew for viewing at this more appropriate time.